Call to order. Can I just ask who's joining us on the phone? Okay. Hi. Welcome. I think I heard Teresa in there as well, right? Oh, hi, Teresa. Okay. Anyone else?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Okay. Well, thanks to everyone who is joining us here in person and those who are on the phone as well. We'll start just with the administrative stuff and get an approval of the agenda. Thank you. I got Mark and Kevin. Any declarations of conflict of interest? Okay. Same. Okay. And we have approval of the previous minutes. You'll note that they are in a bit more standard minute form, and there is, of course, a video archive of the entire meeting that is available online. Can I get a motion to approve, and then if there's any comments? Okay. Any second? Any comments at all in the minutes? No. Okay. So approved.
Sorry, can I just say that we'll take them as amended by Kevin with some corrections to typos.
Great. Okay. Good stuff. So I think that tells us that I think this approach I think is more typical of minutes, and of course gives everyone the chance to view the entire session if they so choose on YouTube. I don't have a lot of opening remarks to start. We will again try to use Slido for the purposes of some of our discussion today. Hopefully you managed to get it all online, and you'll note that it is now divided up into essentially sections throughout our working agenda. So I don't plan to flip as between to try to track. So please put your comments or questions in the appropriate spot in the agenda, and we'll use it that way. We have, I believe, managed to expand the number of characters that's there. So rather than 160, I think Slido allows for a max of 300. And so we've tried to allow for that. And for anyone who's on the phone, hopefully you're on Slido as well. And if you just can put initials or something like that beside your questions so that I'll know who to turn to. But if in addition you want to jump in as part of the discussion, you can, I don't know, you could either make a note on the phone or I suppose send me or Christina message. There's probably a way to ping someone on Slido as well. I figured that out.
I'll send it to Teresa.
Okay. Okay. That'll get sent to you in just a second. Okay. And other than that, we've got an agenda that hopefully reflects many of the kinds of comments that were provided by panel members over the course of the last few weeks. And so thanks to everyone for participating in that, and we'll continue to use that approach to ensure that the panel has the chance to engage in the kind of discussion that it wants to on the various issues as we proceed. That's really all I have. I'll turn it over to Christina for a quick management.
All right, so just a bit of an update in terms of what's happened in the last month since we've been together. Not changing. Can you advance the slide for me, please? Okay, so the Data Trust Primer with Mars has gone live. It went live actually the day after our last meeting, and we did receive some, I would say, pretty favorable media coverage on that. There's been continual feedback on that piece. So the primer is a live living document, so we encourage people to continue to provide any refinements and so on that they see fit. We've continued to go through our info sheets that have come out of the original Civic Lab and have gone through a full social media campaign on those pieces to help to raise awareness on the issues that were brought forward there. Our panelist recruitment has closed. There was 14 applications, which we will discuss today in our closed session. Similarly, our manager of digital governance interviews have been concluded, and we are hoping to provide a bit of an update on that in closed session today. Our second Civic Lab was supposed to be held yesterday, but due to the precarious weather, that has been rescheduled to March the 4th. Additional details with regards to time and location will have been sent to people who were registered. It's nice, though. It now gives us an opportunity to do further call for interested people to attend. There will be some slight adjustments to the speakers for that event just because of availability, so we're just working to firm up the speaker slate as well on that. Then the third Civic Lab will be the week of March the 25th, looking more at data ownership, shared benefit, and monetization, and how that helps to fulfill a smart city business model. Our Stakeholder Advisory Committee, which is almost the Neighborhood Association Advisory Committee, we're having a data-centric session with them at the end of February, and that will essentially be very similar to the materials that DSAP has seen to understand what the impact would be of digital on the new neighborhood, and to get the feedback from the people who are more likely to sort of live in the neighborhood from a grassroots level as well. And then, of course, so there's visibility, the Ontario government, of course, has started their data consultation piece, which is not necessarily related to Quayside, but they've reached out to us to be a part of that and provide input into that process, which we'll be doing through the fullness of time on that. So at a high level, that's kind of what's happened in the last month. If there's any questions, happy to dig a little deeper into those with anyone as well. If not, it will probably continue to be a busy next March and April before we get back together.
Any questions at all? No? Okay. So we've got essentially three main sections over the course of the day. We're going to start with the sidewalk presentation. We'll take a break, then engage in discussions, a brief closed session, and then a longer open one on MIDP review, and then working group related issues, and then another closed session that deals with panel members and some confidentiality issues. So that's the plan for today, and we're right on schedule, so I can turn it over to Sidewalk to the presentation.
So do I need to use the mic, or will people on the phone be able to hear me? It's not a problem.
Good answer, buddy.
Yeah. People on the phone can hear.
Can people on the phone hear me fine now?
There you go.
Okay. Perfect. Happy Valentine's Day, everyone. We're super excited to be here today.
I just like to say that two meetings ago was the 13th of December, which was my wife's 50th birthday, so I'm not batting great right now.
Yeah, and nor am I batting very well at home, but that's okay.
You'll be single at the next meeting.
Exactly.
Smart City Precious Marriages. Yeah.
You brought your wife to the robot show, so that must count.
She did come up for the road for us, honestly.
Craig wouldn't let me. I wanted to actually add a slide in here and bring some heart-shaped chocolates for the room, but Craig kept me away from doing that. But regardless, we're excited to be here today to talk about a bunch of. We didn't put this in yet. So. We're going to talk about well, actually, let's first start at the beginning, which was a recap of January 17th session. On January 17th, we talked about what a neighborhood-scale software-defined network looks like. We talked a little bit about superpassive optical networks, as well as we gave a demo of Koala, which is the outdoor USB port for the city. And then we said that this next time around, we're going to delve into what we mean when we talk about open data and standards. We also had a request from the group that we talk about two specific end-to-end examples of use cases of sensors using the Civic Data Trust, and how we would go about kind of thinking about this as an end-to-end process. So this week we do have two such examples. Oh, there we go, it's working now. So we have two such examples to talk about. And then finally, there were some questions that came up at the end about our approach towards accessibility. And we also published a blog post on this last week or 2 weeks ago. So we decided to tack on a little bit at the end about how we're approaching digital accessibility. And so with these four topics that we'll talk about today, but these three areas, we hope that we're able to get through the full thing have any questions you folks might have, and then leave some time at the end to figure out how we want to arrange future DSAP meetings. This one, by the way, I was commenting earlier, was very helpful to get from the panel here what you folks wanted to hear about last time itself, which helped us set the agenda well and helped us understand, how to proceed to make sure that what we're presenting is of use to you folks. So again, you remember this this wonderful diagram that we presented on October 16th that we'll keep using kind of to tell this story. So we on December, well, actually since that October 16th, what we started noticing was some of the bits that we initially had said were going to be things that Sidewalk Labs would do itself. As our thought process sort of evolved in this, we either realized that things like hardware sensors like traffic volume sensors, things like the Open Data Hub would likely be provided by third parties. And in addition to that, even things like, this concept of a high resolution map, which Craig will talk about a little bit when he talks about open data and standards, was something that would be provided by third parties as well as potentially by Sidewalk Labs. Then on December 13th, we decided to go right to the top application layer and talk about 3 specific use cases, 2 provided by Sidewalk Labs, one around mobility management, another one around energy management. Again, mobility management goal was a traffic-free quayside with 0 deaths from congestion-free with 0 deaths. And then the energy optimization goal was to, hopefully be able to reach climate positivity. That's through a bunch of different activities, but the technology approach was to reduce building energy consumption by approximately 20%. And then we also talked about stormwater management with a third party named Opti about how we would go about trying to manage stormwater in the area. Then on January 17th, we presented a few specific components kind of on the flip side of this platform diagram, if you will. Talking about the physical mounts, the koalas again, as well as the connectivity layer, the ubiquitous Wi-Fi, as well as the SuperPON technology that enables kind of lower infrastructure, more capacity around fiber. And then today we're going to kind of we're going to get right to that middle layer. There we go. We're going to get right to that middle layer and talk about the Open Data Hub, but more or less about open standards and APIs and how we're approaching that, as well as a little bit about using a high resolution map as a specific use case. So we hope this kind of helps you think about how we are walking through the different layers of infrastructure that we think will be used for essentially digital infrastructure at Quayside. So again, very quickly where we are today.
Is it skipping?
Yeah, it's skipping forward too, but anyway. So here's where we are today. This is the usual disclaimer slide as I've been presenting every week. We're very early in the overall product development cycle, so this work does represent our most current thinking. That said, we keep learning from panels like this and from feedback from folks like you, and hopefully we'll continue to iterate on that. Secondly, throughout this development process, we have very much taken to heart the concepts of responsible data use and the principles and ensuring that we are following privacy by design principles in the things that we're doing. As well as continuing to think about how these things will interact with our proposal for a civic data trust. And then finally, the ideas that we are describing, will use published standards, either standards that we publish or existing published standards out there, and we'll actually go into quite a bit of detail about what that actually fundamentally means today. So I wanted to have a little quick aside for a second. I don't know how many of you have seen. This is a very common picture that's used in product management. It's called the double diamond approach to the product development cycle. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. So for those of you that aren't, this is a very common way to think about how product development is done. On the y-axis, what you can think of that is the expanding number of ideas and then the contracting number of solutions. And so what you get initially is the idea that you're trying to understand the market and build customer empathy. These are usually stages where you do everything from ethnographic research or following people around, understanding their behaviors, market surveys, seeing what's going on in the industry right now. You're essentially trying to circle in on a hypothesis around what is the problem set you're trying to solve. Once you get there, then you start brainstorming a ton of solutions, and that's kind of your ideation phase. So now you have a litany of solutions that exist out there. And now you have to figure out which one you want to play with first. And that's kind of circling in on the one pain and potentially the one that you want to actually think that you can solve with this, right? So once you get to that one pain point, it's kind of the first cross point of that diamond, right? So now your hypothesis is pretty set. You know what you're trying to solve. So, to use the mobility example, our goal here is, a congestion-free quayside, right? So that's the goal. That's the pain we're trying to solve against. And then you go ahead and you start figuring out, now, how are we going to go about solving it? And this is what is normally referred to as the stage where you start figuring out what your minimum viable product is. And again, this goes through a secondary stage of a lot of brainstorming and ideation, and you get a ton of different potential solutions. And then you sketch some of those, you rapidly prototype them, you get out there, you try to iterate on them, and then you quickly try to kill as many of them as possible to come back down to the one MVP you're going to take out of that prototyping stage and maybe start actually piloting in some way, shape, or form. So this is a very common way to think about it. And the reason I wanted to present this to you folks is for two reasons. One is, one of the key differences I think that we've added along the way when we think about Sidewalk Lab's approach to product development is the importance of privacy by design very early in the cycle, close to the ideation stage itself. As we start thinking about the hypothesis of what the pain point is, we also start considering, before we start getting into the ideation and prototyping and sketching stage, what the effect of those solutions and those pain points could be from a privacy perspective, right? And how different, and that kind of affects this cycle a little bit in how we think about it. But secondly, most of the products that we've been presenting so far are still fairly early in this stage. We haven't really gotten to the stage yet where, we're pushing out live pilots. And we're still in this early part of the ideation of the brainstorm creation and circling down to those MVPs that we're going to get out there. As we iterate on those, then we start gaining more clarity, because until real individuals, residents, users start using these products, we'll be unable to actually determine, are they working as we intended? Is the pain that we determined initially through this research methodology actually true or not in the field? And so there are many books that talk about this. Eric Ries's The Lean Startup is probably the most well-known one, but I wanted to give a little bit of insight into how we think about our product development cycle internally, also to help you folks understand where we envision ourselves in that stage. Before I moved on to the first example, I just wanted to pause here for a second and ask folks if they had any questions about this.
Yeah, I'm just typing it into Slido.
Go for it.
I understand that this diagram is very common and a helpful way of thinking about product development, but my understanding is that what the project here is one that involves a great deal more public engagement than is typical for product development. And so I would suggest that model needs to be modified to accommodate in that early diamond for an iterative process of public engagement. And this is what I understand was envisaged in your early document, but we're very late in that phase, and I'd say that there hasn't been very much around the digital layer aspects. And I wonder if you could comment on that and suggest ways in which we can actually, I say that both as the panel and also more broadly in a public engagement way, actually be involved in, say, the prototyping and the ideation around those in that first phase, because that is critical. And once the plan is set, then your scope has been greatly decreased, and then you're trying to modify something that's already gone on. And
so to answer the first part of your question, I actually think what you're saying is a fair critique of how product management is practiced today, but I think that's bad product management too. Like, good product management takes in like that early stage of understanding iconography, talking out there to residents, understanding users is something that we very much embody inside Sidewalk Labs, have taken very seriously. And I think that differentiates good and bad product management, right? Either you believe in your head that you know what people need and you go fix it for them, or you actually do surveys, understand the field, understand what's happening locally, really understand the people and do a study of that. And I do believe that through our interactions in the public roundtables, through numerous, I know myself, numerous visits here personally, talking to folks who are in industry currently, residents, city folks in the city on the city governance side. We've had numerous interactions that have really helped us kind of understand the space better. So I would disagree that we haven't done much there. I think we've actually done quite a bit there. I think part of coming to this DSAP is another example of that, where getting that feedback from all of you is an extremely important component.
I would agree that you've done much more than is typical in this, but my understanding was that there would be more of an interactive engagement rather than field studies, which is what you are basically talking about. So anyway.
Yeah, I think the other lens I'd look at this through is through the question of what is the product in this case, and if we sit back a second from the Digital Strategy Advisory Panel and think about the project as a whole, the products I think we're talking about at the level of mobility. How do we allow people to move around? Sustainability. How do we heat and cool efficiently? Construction of buildings and so on. So some of which involve some digital technology and some don't. In the sense like our goals don't say use digital technology for X, and so the teams around mobility and sustainability and buildings and so on have been engaging quite a bit at that level. And then you could also think about some of the things we've been talking about as quote unquote products, but the digital pieces are really in service of those other things. And so maybe the exact way that the software defined network works doesn't it directly, the users of that are actually the other applications that want to actually do things in cities rather than the citizens directly, for example. And so in some cases, these products are kind of deep down in the bowels of the infrastructure, and users are people like you potentially who are well educated around digital issues. The one area that I think is a big exception to what I just said is around data, the use of data and privacy and so on, where I think we actually started off at a sort of a less developed and less nailed down state, and there has been a pretty fruitful discussion. So I think that part of the public engagement has been more robust, because there's actually both pull from us, but largely push from folks that are concerned.
I had actually Charles up next.
Yeah, it's a bit related to what Andrew asked, but in terms of the product development life cycle, I know the double down. Who is doing what there? So I think part of some of the questions that are emerging is Sidewalk is working on a plan as part of the MIDP, but at the same time, as doing the planning, there's product development happening, sort of behind the scenes. So I think there's sort of maybe a sense of knowing what. I know you have to balance between disclosure of confidentiality in terms of product development, but number one is there a roadmap that we can look at, or just sort of a general view of what's being worked on, first of all, and secondly, just thinking about the civic tech movement, is there a way that the community can get involved with the product development itself, right? Working and making and doing together with you. Is there a mechanism for that to happen?
So on your first question, we've actually, I think after this presentation, I'm fairly sure, except for one effort, we would have touched on every single effort that we have teams kind of resourced around at this point.
And I think it's worth maybe just for clarity, just enumerating the things that we're, that our teams are currently, because it's certainly not everything we've described, because our team is still relatively small. We're on the order of 15 engineers and a half dozen product managers and so on. So it's not a massive team to do all of this. And so the things we are working on are this idea of generative design. So I don't know how many of you have had a chance to be in 307 and play with this is, the experience goes back sort of 9 months, so it's kind of earlier work, but the idea that you should be able to computationally explore lots of potential layouts for a city and massings and so on in order to
the screen.
Correct, exactly. Yeah. So that's one project which has to do with the very early parts of planning. Another is Koala, which you saw. Mobility. Right. So then there's a team working more generally on sustainability, which currently has one engineer on it. So this is very much in the ideation phase as well. That's around how much can we improve efficiency of heating and cooling. And right now that's really at an analytics stage. See if we can work with some buildings to understand the energy flows in those buildings, how much energy is being used, and talk to a lot of players who might be potentially involved in finding solutions. So that's very, very early. Mobility more generally, we talked about that earlier around, and we're going to talk about it today again. And that is focused on this double parking problem, basically the dynamic curve, and then more efficient flows of vehicles. And those both rely on, we're assuming that somebody else builds the sensors and so on, for those. And so that would be that again, pretty early. What am I missing?
And then, so to your second question around, the project that we haven't spoken to you folks about because it's very nascent and early in exploration is, we touched on it, I think, in the December session, saying that there are technologies coming out to enhance privacy. We dropped some terms like zero knowledge proofs and so on and so forth, and that exploration continues right now, and we're not sure where that exploration goes yet, but we realize that there's a pain point here around privacy. We realize there are technologies that are coming about that can help in that space, so we're trying to figure out how to bring those two together. The other, to your second point around how to engage, folks like Civic Tech Toronto better, for example. We in our 307 space, we did actually host, I think for a good 6 months or so last year, Civic Tech Toronto Tuesday meetups that were happening. Spent a lot of time engaging with the community. One of our kind of learnings from that was, how do we engage the community better? And so one of the things that we have spun up this year is a rapid prototyping kind of group internally that can work with local community stakeholders. And we're still determining what the scope of projects is and the size of the team is going to be. It's, again, still early in that process, but that is something we're excited to see if it can help in this space.
Okay, I have Curtis, I have Yuta with a question online, and I have Dave as well. And I'd like to jump in, and there's a panel. Okay.
Just quickly, I guess, and just to build on something you said, Craig, I think, I like the model. I think I wonder whether some of the angst that Andrew talks about that we see manifest in lots of different ways is like, when you think about what is the product, right? Which you sort of touched on, is like there, in a really generalized sense, there's like three layers to it. There's like the information architecture, there's the platforms, the mobility platform, the energy platform, or whatever, and then there's the products, right? Like the thing you plug into your wallet in your house or the UI you interface with. And so it strikes me that it's a very complex, if we mean the entire hierarchy of that all shipping at once, I don't envy that effort.
Yeah.
But I guess I think when you talk about sort of where you are in this evolution, do you mean what layer of that product hierarchy do you mean? Because I think I don't want to speak for Andrew, but my guess is that the information architecture is probably more interesting to the public than what this widget does to power a streetlight or.
I would argue the things we've spoken of today are actually that middle layer that you talked about probably the most. We'll talk a little bit about information architecture at the end of this presentation to give you an idea about that. But I think this is fairly representative. Now, look, the other big difference here I would say is, we were having a great conversation about agile development, right? And how, to some extent, this is a lot closer to waterfall style development where, rather than being able to kind of rapidly go out there and iterate, we're almost writing down plans, which is what, I like to joke at times saying the MIDIP is the world's longest product requirements doc, and so, if we're kind of in this position of planning before doing, there's always the danger that, you're not actually going out there and validating with the customer. And so we have to find that sweet spot, and we're still learning how to do that. This comes to your point about how we integrate more closely with the community to actually have that interaction be able to happen to make sure we're achieving that product market fit that we're looking for in each of these things. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah. I mean, I think so. If I play that back to you, you are trying to deliver that entire hierarchy. Like when that ship box is the entire hierarchy delivers it once.
Yes, but it cannot turn on the first time when Quayside quote unquote turns on, right? That would be terrible product management. So we will have to pilot these, understand how they work, make sure they work before, I like to joke the difference between, my previous job where you kind of write some code, you kick it out there, you have a few million people play with it, run some A/B testing, If it doesn't work, you pull it. If it does work, you iterate on it, right? It's a little different in the urban realm in this space because obviously people are living there. We have to be a lot more cognizant of the balances and risks of something quote unquote not working. And so there's a lot more that goes into this early planning phase, which I think is the correct way to go about it. It's actually almost moving a little backwards if you think about how product management has evolved over the last 20 years. But on the flip side, one could argue also it's a much more thoughtful route to take to ensure that what we're building here actually achieves that, as I called it, the product market fit, if you will, or utility for the residents of this new area.
I'll go to Utah on the phone. You have a question.
So to some extent on those pain points, that's something that, as part of even the RFP process, Waterfront Toronto came together with a framework of what they viewed as some of the major issues that they're looking to, the outcomes they're looking to achieve in the Quayside development, right? And I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it has been, as Craig mentioned, we have subject matter experts in the areas of mobility, sustainability, who've been working in the space for many years and doing a lot of studies around what are the existing pain points in urban places. And I think the confluence of those two together have allowed us to start circling around some of these pain points. And so to some extent, to answer your question, did we get the recall set of all the pain points? Absolutely not, right? But we're focusing on a few of those pain points that we've presented over the last few months. In addition to that, I would add at the end of the presentation, when Craig talks about the open standards and APIs by which we're trying to build out this district with, we very much have taken the stance that we're trying not to build, if you will, the iPhone of districts, but the internet of districts, in the sense that that it allows for open innovation of things that we cannot imagine today, either potentially as pain points or as solutions to those pain points that allow others to innovate on top of it and allow kind of that wisdom of the crowds process to occur in Quayside. Is that it?
Yeah, absolutely. The only other thing I'd add is actually relevant to Utah as well, is that, for example, I don't think we knew enough about challenges around accessibility, and so we'll talk about this at the end, but kind of we worked with OKU to have a set of co-design sessions, invited the community to tell us what they found as challenges, what we should be focusing on. So, even in the last 6 months, I think we've learned a huge amount. And that's not to say we have an exhaustive set of all pain points that need to be solved in the cities. We're still open, but I think we're moving in the right direction.
Curtis asked my original question, so I'll ask a subsequent question. I like how you're doing the prototyping and low fidelity things before you code. To help maybe remove the angst, is there any way, is there any kind of portal or dashboard where we can see this information coming in of what you're extracting from what you're learning from these groups, so we get an idea continually what kind of findings we're finding, and give us an opportunity to maybe vote on which ones we think are more critical and some are less, because we can't solve all of them, but what are the ones that we're willing to invest and experiment early on, and what are the ones we're going to defer?
Yeah, I mean, we have, out of each engagement, we generally have a report that summarizes, what things were raised, including, when we talked recently about accessibility a week or so ago, as Prem mentioned, there's a blog post that links to a document that kind of describes at a high level. And also OCADU have released their own descriptions of, for example, the co-design sessions.
And the same thing with the Civic Data Trust, essentially, right? With the Civic Data Trust also, Mars had a whole co-design session around what a civic data trust looks like.
They kind of did that more on their own back,
but still, it's another example of like a proposal that goes and iterates with community engagement.
And likewise from the roundtables. Now, I think having said all that, the one thing we haven't done is kind of brought them all together in a coherent list. So to get to them all, you would go to our website and look at a bunch of documents. That might be something we should. And actually, now I think about it, this is also summarized in the draft that we currently have of the MIDIP. So some part of the MIDIP will also be, here's what we heard for each area and reflecting that back.
But if it's online, then we can interact more frequently as you do it more, and that way you're not having to publish a report, then get the feedback back. There was some kind of online or more connected way, we can interlace quicker and might help.
Okay.
We'll
think about that.
We can look into that usual issues of you put it online and then the votes are very biased, right? So, usual things that we have to think about with that, but we'll definitely take a look at it.
I got votes, so I'll ask the next question. We've got a couple more. And then
Nice.
So as you were going through the sort of the start of the pyramid with the sort of gathering of ideas, a piece in the Logic this week kind of came to mind. You may have seen it. Hopefully you did, talking about Barcelona and its smart city. And one of the things that struck me about the piece was the emphasis in it that talks about how the city tried to, in a sense, scale that pyramid at the start by reaching out and talked to a very large percentage of members of the city participating in that. And I think implicit in part of that article was somehow to suggest that you're doing it differently or that Toronto isn't doing it the same way. And I guess I was wondering whether or not you would agree.
I know.
And how you would characterize your effort to, and in a sense, identify what are the issues that are in need of solving as opposed to presenting solutions and then figuring out whether or not people want this or not.
So I would slightly disagree in that I think maybe the big difference is that while Barcelona did it as city governance to do the reach out, I think that there's a difference between that versus Sidewalk Labs potentially doing that for sure from private entity versus government entity perspective. But that said, the roundtables we've hosted, the conversations we've had, the engagements with universities, with OCADU, with companies, in the private sector, with nonprofits and groups like that. Like we have, when we do publish the MIDIP, I think there is somewhere where there will be an exhaustive list of these interactions. And, I think last week we were reviewing one such list for kind of our interactions we've had when we think about digital technologies. And in my opinion, it is a fairly large list, right? And we have done quite a bit of engagement out there.
I'd also echo Prem's point earlier about the RFP, and I don't know if Christina wants to talk to this, but in some ways, Waterfront Toronto had the equivalent role of Barcelona in gathering what are the challenges of the waterfront, what are the challenges of Toronto, and reflecting those in the RFP as here are the pain points that we would like a partner to help solve.
So you're suggesting that scaling the pyramid took place or should have taken place before the RFP was as part of the process of developing the RFP?
I think that's an input into this question of what problems are we solving. But so saying that the work done before I think is another input to the product development cycle.
And sorry if I can just respond to that. I think what we learned during the market sounding process and the works with some of our government partners actually helped to inform the RFP. So there was elements of that being done, not just for that RFP, but we were also going through what was Waterfront Toronto's second phase of its life going to look like. So it was part of a broader set of consultations. Mark was actually still our chair at that time.
Yeah. So the other comment I would make is the fundamental difference is that Barcelona got a new mayor. And as a city, they undertook an initiative. That's not what happened here. What happened here was that Waterfront Toronto took a lead on a parcel of land. So structurally, it's really quite different. And so, trying to compare the two, I don't know how you compare the two.
That's fair. No, and I appreciate that the structures are different. It's just what resonated for me was the product development parallels.
Yeah, and the other difference is this was actually to take a vacant piece of land and turn it into something as a particular project, which achieved the bunch of goals that have been articulated, particularly articulated in the RFP, whereas Barcelona was looking at citywide services. Really very different kinds of scopes in terms of what, there's intersection of issues, sure there is, but to try and, say one's doing it right and one's doing it wrong, whichever way you want to weigh that one, I think just misrepresents the difference in the project.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to say one was right or wrong, just trying to.
The other thing I just want to make sure that you heard from us on the answer to you is that the Waterfront Toronto's work beforehand is an input into the process, but it does not mean that we think that process is done, nor do I. This is a very linear drawing that you have here for sake of academic expediency, but there are a ton of feedback loops that keep circling you around in this cycle. As anyone here who's ever built a product and pushed it out there in the market knows, like, every one of these stages is basically a loop back to zero, and you keep iterating over and over and over again. Feels a little bit like snakes and ladders sometimes.
If we don't stick too far, step back.
No, I guess as a planner, I feel the need just to remind everybody that building a product isn't the same thing as building a city, and we're talking about cities as platform, but we don't plan products in cities. And when governments lead consultation processes, you lead them on behalf of elected officials who ultimately take decisions. This is a much different thing. It's just really important to remind everyone that you can have an amazing consultation process by a private sector vendor and by a government agency, but that's not the same thing as what the government's going to do. And the City of Toronto did a really good job. I think the Waterfront Secretariat provided a whole bunch of detail in the last 10 days about what's going to happen with the planning process, which I think is a really useful input, but I just want to remind everyone that this isn't the same thing. They may seem the same, but they're quite different.
Great.
So.
There are several more questions there, but why don't we pause for a sec and continue and allow you to present at least one or two of the case studies, and we can circle back to some of those questions.
Sounds good. All right, so I'm going to start using this because it keeps sending me 2 slides at a time. So let's start with the first. Whoa, I didn't even touch anything there. Let's start with the first use case, which is the real-time measurement to improve mobility. So one of the examples we talked about back in December was the idea of a mobility system, again, with the goal of decreasing congestion. And again, we believe that to achieve that, we need to understand what's actually happening in the intersections or streets in the area. And at the end of the day, there are cameras, which are great technologies to use, but how do we find something that allows you to do that in a privacy-preserving, de-identified, and cost-effective way? So that was sort of one of the goals that we're trying to get after when we think about why. In addition to that, again, by finding that device, can we actually understand the flow of pedestrians, bicycles, vehicles, other such things, to actually understand what's actually happening, what's the current state, that situational awareness. So what we're trying to do here fundamentally is, as a stand-in for the future street, we're going to use 307, which is, 307 Lakeshore Boulevard, our flagship space right now, to be able to aggregate statistics about how people are spending their time outside 307 and use that as an example to be able to see whether we can do sensing in a de-identified way at source. And so we, again, are trying to apply these responsible data use guidelines, see how this would work kind of end to end, as well as we found a sensor called Numina, and we'll talk a bit in detail about Numina, that has a way of classifying, essentially drawing boxes around items and classifying them from an image perspective and then passing on the box rather than the image itself. And so I'll talk through a little more detail. If we go to the next slide. So Numina employs on-device processing essentially to detect and be able to de-identify items from an actual image. And so what it does is it ends up generating these paths and things on the screen that, essentially get classified into these, I believe, 3 or 4 broad buckets around pedestrians, cyclists, or vehicles. And I think vehicles is broken up between cars and trucks, correct? I think so. And so I think there are 4 things that it actually creates as buckets. And then they do not include any other information except for the category and the potential timestamp. So let's talk through at a level of detail what that actually means from a data flow perspective, because this is where it actually gets interesting, right? So you can imagine you have the on-site Numina sensor. And what the Numina sensor is doing is it's capturing that imagery. It's taking that imagery and on board it's using de-identification technology, and what it's pushing to the cloud server is this kind of gobbledygook text that you see in green and yellow, but what that's actually telling you is a timestamp, the location of the box in the image, what type of thing it is. So in this case, it's saying it's a pedestrian, as well as an ID for the path that it may be taking. And so this sort of ability to pull out this de-identified piece of data and then store that in the cloud arguably allows for this privacy by design concept to be implemented in the real world. Now, the Numina sensor, because of the need for Q&A to assure it's running properly, every hour it sends one random image and it transmits that to the cloud. It blurs out, again, faces in that image to do the best that it can to ensure that it stays depersonalized, that image de-identified, that image will sit in the cloud for approximately 30 days and then get deleted after those 30 days. And it's there purely from a QA perspective on the Numina servers. So one of the things that we wanted to do is, again, implement this to really understand how individuals interact with things like our outdoor raincoats that we're setting up for all weather existence. So we're setting that up in 307 right now. We're setting up a Numina sensor there, and we'll be able to better understand the use case there. So we started setting up an RDUA, if you go to the next slide, to get a better understanding of what the potential impacts of such an item would be. So again, the key kind of privacy or data governance consideration here for this pilot is that there's potential personal information that's being captured because there's a sensor here. And the idea is that because we are able to do that de-identification of those images on device, we're able to mitigate the potential risks associated with image collection. In terms of transparency, we want to make sure that people understand that there is these sensors exist, where they are. So there's some signage, as well as some, even the invitations to 307 now contain information that these sensors are up there as a way of providing that, if you will, at least consent to understand that such a thing is there. In addition to that, from a security perspective, we're making sure that all images are sent via the right encryption standards so that they're end-to-end encrypted. And then finally, we made the decision that this was an interesting pilot to approve, to actually move forward with internally, because of the fact that it takes into account the idea of privacy by design, de-identification by default, all of those items. So this is kind of the first end-to-end example of where you can see we came up with an initial hypothesis around mobility. We needed a way to test out that hypothesis. Again, this comes to how do you iterate on something like this. We found a potential sensor out there that we wanted to test with this, a use case, found a way to do it in a de-identified way, and we'll be launching this pilot hopefully in the next week or two in 307 to be able to, again, test it out and see whether this is a potential future third party that we can utilize for the space we're building out in Quayside. So this was one of your questions, right, from last time. So I wanted to, I don't know whether you had a specific question.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm glad you found a de-identification at source solution. So that's great. I wanted to come back to your problem statement, actually, because you've mentioned a couple of times now, eliminating congestion, reducing congestion. I would challenge that that's a correct problem statement for a dense urban environment. There is a school of thought that says congestion is in fact, a success factor. It's a measure of the fact that people want to be there. People relate congestion to traffic jams, and this is maybe a different topic for a neighborhood scale that we're talking about. So I think you need to. I'm not sure what the right problem statement is here. Whether it's throughput or effectiveness or safety, or I don't know, but I'm not sure that continuing to focus on congestion is the right topic.
So it's funny you say that, because we got very similar pushback last week when we were kind of doing a review of this stuff with Larry Page, where his thing was about throughput again also, because he was saying if things are moving slow, that doesn't matter as long as everyone's moving, right? And so kind of thinking about this, I think, is a good way to kind of expand how we think about these problem sets, and I completely agree with you. But I would say that from a traffic congestion perspective on the roads, we presented this in December, that if you look at the lost productivity of time, as well as the increased pollution that's caused by vehicles idling, stuck in traffic, those two are real societal costs and burdens, right? So we do think that those are actual pains that are solvable by basically being able to manage that flow or that throughput better. And to be able to manage that flow or throughput better, you need to understand or have that situational awareness that then leads you to this problem set.
Maybe, but there is the phenomenon called induced demand. So, people who understand this far better than I do have said that when you put a lane of traffic in, an extra lane to create extra capacity, it actually improves things for about 3 months.
Yeah.
And then it actually is worse because you're inducing more people to actually come into the streets. So
yeah, absolutely.
So anyway, I'm not here to propose a problem statement. I'm just challenging that you need to evolve the problem. Like, what is this for? Is I don't think congestion is the right language to use.
Yeah, I you're absolutely right that there are a whole lot of issues around here that we're sort of glossing over pretty simplistically. And I'd also put myself in the same camp that you claimed yourself in, where we have colleagues that are much more sophisticated about how mobility works and transportation works and the issues around induced demand and so on. I think in this we're saying having people essentially stuck in traffic is not a great outcome, producing, in the current case, obviously, pollutants and so on, wasting time and so on. I don't think the issue is making everybody able to go, 200 kilometers an hour and therefore have maximum throughput. I think there are a bunch of questions about how you actually manage this well. But we think that one part of that is good. It has to be understanding what's actually going on the street in real time. Maybe an easier example to think about or discuss or agree on is the double parking piece, which is probably not helpful in general to have a truck kind of sitting in the middle of the street when people are trying to use it to go places. So we could get more sophisticated about exactly those questions. I'd probably bring in one of our colleagues to sort of talk about that in good deep.
Yeah, and then to your truck example, in Toronto, that would be the truck sitting in the bike lane, actually.
right, exactly.
Okay, Dave?
Is there an opportunity, because I see this could be used for a safety thing too, especially what I brought up in the first meeting and what I've been experiencing the last few weeks is the snow and ice around the curb cuts. If we know there's pedestrians a mobility challenge, either in a chair or walker, the way we do the lights to cross the street should be adjusted. Because it's went green when I still have been able to just get to the middle of the street.
So
and luckily I'm not worth a lot of points to hit, so they wait for me to cross.
the CEO of Numina, I'm forgetting what Tara, what's her name? Tara Pham. If you find her on Twitter, she was actually talking about this. I think it was last week she was talking about this with an actual example of where you can use the Numina sensor to understand paths of movement and see where snow has not been properly removed based on the paths of movement.
Right.
And so there are some really interesting use cases and applications.
And we've used the example of somebody crossing the road where they haven't gotten to the other side yet and the light should be held.
Or to find an alternative path because the curb cuts are filled.
Exactly.
So then do I go 2 blocks over or do I?
Absolutely, and that's, by the way, something we heard in the co-design sessions with OKU is actually about snow and curb cuts specifically. How problem that is if you have any mobility challenges. I also put a plug in for a couple of weeks ago. We had the autonomous snowplow competition down at 307, which was a competition with a number of college teams building robots that would actually clear the snow automatically. Now, these were college projects. They weren't. Curtis dropped by briefly to have a look. They weren't all incredibly successful, but it was sort of interesting to see how various teams went about solving the same problem in very different ways. And to be honest, we have sort of an internal discussion right now about whether we don't think snow should build up in quayside and places where people need to get around. Whether you deal with that by heating pavement or whether you deal with it with some sort of robotics, or maybe there's a third approach. We're still having that slight argument. We can go deeper into that, I feel like. But
we've been prioritized which ones get shoveled out first.
Well, that's where I actually thought you were going initially. Exactly. You could use, if you understood what was going on, you could prioritize some curb cuts to be cleared before others because you knew either they were particularly bad or they were particularly busy.
There are several questions that are all in the same ballpark, essentially around re-identification. With some UTA notes someone in a wheelchair, for example, there may be fewer people in wheelchairs, so the likelihood of re-identification is greater. What protections are available there? Andrew also has raised questions about potential re-identification through combining some other sources. And I raised the question sort of looking at it from the other side. Let's say you have an Amber Alert, and in fact you get significant public pressure to identify because perhaps the missing child is walking across the street. Wouldn't it be good if we could identify? And I guess the question is to understand, is any of, what are the safeguards and, what's the answer to the people, to pressure to say, hey, turn this on so there's a way to identify?
So actually, taking the last one first, I don't think we have a perfect answer to this, but one is for example, just to have completely parallel systems. So maybe the police do have cameras. Everybody knows what those cameras are for example, for that use case. But even though you're in a sense duplicating equipment or technology, that's maybe the cleanest solution, right? So the sensors put up by the mobility, whoever's running the mobility system, are always de-identified and there's no way to retrieve. But there's a police system as well running in parallel where those data streams never interact, but it's possible to solve the Amber Alert case. I don't know that that's the perfect solution, but we need to continue that discussion. And on the re-identification question, I think that again is going to be an ongoing policy and technical question. I don't know that there's a silver bullet. There's a lot of research in this area, but for example, we were having a discussion when we were putting this deck together about the fact that Numina right now doesn't identify anybody in the trails, but you do have individual trails, and in some cases that might be fine. There's a bunch of people crossing the street always back and forth, and there's nothing in particular about a one trail that identifies somebody. But imagine hypothetically that a camera had a view of somebody's front door and it was a single family home. Knowing that somebody came out of that door and maybe went to this door at a certain time, that seems kind of creepy. So, you could, for example, aggregate a lot of those paths and exclude any data that was sort of a singleton piece of data or that originated from somewhere private. We think that a lot of the use cases actually really what they need is aggregate volume over a period of an hour. This kind of, we have this kind of markup of, where we know roughly over an hour how many people go left, how many people go right, and maybe how many people, roughly, again, a range of numbers, how many people stopped at a particular location. But again, I think understanding the risk of re-identification even here would involve discussion and maybe folks thinking like an adversary and trying to re-identify. And I think that technology needs to get better over time. But I don't think it's a once and done technical problem.
For the specific wheelchair question, because of our actually chat last time about this specific issue, we actually ended up asking this specific question and went all the way to Numina to find out. And right now they don't actually have a training set big enough to differentiate wheelchair users from pedestrians, and so they don't know what the actual precision recall is, for example. But in addition, the boxes or the actual categories that they create, they don't have a separate category for that use case right now. I actually thought at first blush that's an okay thing, because in the sense that from a privacy preserving perspective and a numbers perspective, that makes some sense right now. But I still think that this is where business rules come into play. So when you think about the business rules around data collection, data access, what gets made public and what you can or can't access, this is where you can write these rules in play that essentially force some level of aggregation either over time or over geography that allow you to still understand these things without individually affecting any individual's privacy.
Kevin, did you want to follow up? You had a couple questions that are kind of data related.
So I'll start with, I think, is the easier one. So the de-identified data in this application, is it theoretically open data, or can it be theoretically open data, or what process would you follow to go through to decide whether it will be open data?
So I think this comes back to what I was saying earlier about business rules around this. So I think we need to, in the ideal use case, because these would be set up in the public realm, they would be made publicly available by default in something like through something like a civic data trust, right? We have been reading and kind of circling around the Estonia model of a civic data trust, where Estonia's X-Roads has the concept where each individual can set up their sensor and have their own private database around it, but a central authority controls access to that database, by making sure that the use case is specified and the way it's being used can be done in such a way that still is privacy preserving. So I think that sort of is how we're thinking about this right now. The way that would be made publicly available obviously would be in some published open standard that folks can use. There's a question about how to make that available in near real time while still ensuring the privacy of individuals and so on and so forth. So there are a bunch of questions there that we have to figure out.
And I think another important piece of this is that, as we've suggested that this be set up, we wouldn't actually be able to say whether this is open data. That's a role for the data trust to decide, right? So in Quayside, we're proposing that there's another body that decides, whether or not whoever put these sensors up has to make that open data, make it all open, make some aspect of it open. So for example, I think Curtis brought this up, some time ago. You might imagine having, whoever, not necessarily in Quayside, but somewhere else, somebody who spent money to put sensors up, being able to having to share open data in aggregate, with some delay, but having access to the real-time data to make use of that to defray the cost of the sensors. So I think that's a question that whether we set up, whether Toronto sets up essentially an entity to decide these things, gets debated and decided independently of somebody like Sidewalk Labs.
All right, I've got. There's an anonymous question, and then there might be comments from Pamela and Charles, and then perhaps we'll move on to. I don't know who posted the anonymous question about. Where was it? The third party sensors in a privately managed space. Okay.
So this RDUA is for the actual. Again, this is where the details, are a little bit different here. This is the actual use case of a Numina sensor being placed outside of 307 Lakeshore Boulevard East. So that is a private. 307 is a privately managed space managed by Sidewalk Labs, and the public, because it's a privately managed public space because it's facing outdoors.
Well, right, and we invite the public in, and we're gonna make sure the cameras, for example, don't capture public sidewalks. They're looking at space that is within the bounds of 307. But it's a private space that we're inviting the public to.
So this is not referring to Quayside as a private space at all. This is referring to 307 Lakeshore Boulevard East. Probably should have added that somewhere in there. Thanks for the heads up.
Okay, Pamela, did you?
Just a small caution that I think the example about the pedestrians and the efficiency is a really good, again, it's like the theme of today, difference between building a product and building city building. Like good urban design, business improvement areas want people to be slow moving and to stop and talk and engage on sidewalks, right? So just a reminder that optimization isn't always good.
Absolutely.
You know that, but I'm saying it out loud. And also just that it's curious to me, like this tool, it's like the quantification of what urban designers call desire lines, right? Which is just trying to create a big data set around how people move through space. And we do that with clipboards and photos right now. And the common space tool that you brought forward 1 or 2 DSEPs ago was basically a scaled up version of what William White and other urban designers have been doing for a long time too. So it's interesting to see what happens when you apply this technology, but also a good reminder that we do this in smaller scales in different contexts, but that the goals are different, right? It's not optimization, but high quality public space.
And yes, that's right. And I think it reinforces the point that was made earlier that we really are oversimplifying the urbanism part of this, because we're kind of rushing through that and saying this is the digital strategy advisory panel. This is one chapter kind of at the end of the MIDIP that is preceded by a number of chapters written by people who have deep background on things like Harley White's experiments and so on. Yeah. So our apologies for being maybe
it's
under
the hell of having a planner at the DSEP table. Yeah, got it. Thanks.
Okay, I'll give Charles both comments.
Sorry, can I just say one more thing about your point? I do think though that what's interesting is when we think about tools like the generative design tool though on the flip side, right? Like your point around, one of the things that we're trying to figure out, can we model out, is the idea of collisions. Because collisions are a good thing from a people walking in.
By the way, let's be clear what we mean by collisions in this case.
People.
Well,
and not physical stopping
collision.
to talk.
Right. Bumping into each other. Right, exactly.
Yes, but in a model you call them. but like something like that where yes, maybe that's not the most efficient path one can take, but that's not the point of it, right? The point is can we go to that pain that cities feel today, which is that isolation that's caused a lot of times. And so these are things that we do think about, and that largely is, we're able to think about it because of our counterparts who are much smarter than us in the urban planning space.
It's a really curious, I mean, I know you can't pick where 307 is located, but if you were doing this in any other research setting, it would be like the worst possible site for pedestrian interaction because it's so isolated. Like there's nothing, it's a very, so just be mindful about scaling up a single site experiment around behavior because it's like the moon in terms of landscape for humans.
100%. Yeah, but there are some challenges with putting out cameres in real public sidewalks, which is why we're doing it.
You gotta just be mindful of
it. It's very hard to get a coffee or tea around there too.
Okay, one last with Charles. I don't know if you wanted to raise a question.
It's sort of similar to what you were saying, but I think this exact conversation is where we're seeing the smart city conversation is we've seen technology come into cities. Technology has been built, particularly over the last 20 years. They developed, agility, product design methodologies, but they're often around a product lens, and they tend to be solving a set of, with respect, rather simplistic problems. And you bring them into the urban environment with a lot of different people, a lot of different problems, and sort of all intersecting. And so I think it's the evaluation framework that we look at to try to understand that there's different sets of priorities and yes, the rules-based can work, but we have to make sure we're not being too simplistic about the result, because what will end up is we saw the first steps on smart cities where they were criticized because the goals were efficiency, and that tends to come from the technology side. And secondly, there's a lot of techniques already being used in urban planning that it might look really cool at first if you're using technology, but it's the same technique that's been used for 50 years. How can we bring them together to do something new? And I think that's kind of part of the challenge that we sort of, when we're looking at if we're starting with the problem and the very complex set of users, some of which have paradoxical needs. How do we bring in a technology that helps kind of manage that?
One quick comment. I completely agree with you about the history of smart cities. I hate the term. I hate that phrase because it comes from this world of, wow, we could replace streetlights with cheaper streetlights to run and add a bunch of sensors, and surely that could be useful for something. And that is the history of technology in cities. I think the reason I joined Sidewalk Labs is because the majority of Sidewalk Labs are actually urbanists who are coming at it from exactly the other perspective you're talking about. Yeah, in a way, the lens that we're looking at, where we're looking through these panel presentations, a little bit too much like the smart cities lens, because we are focused on digital technology. But I don't know if it'd be useful to somehow try to situate this better in future with some of our urbanist colleagues and kind of walk through and be a bit more sophisticated on the urbanism side of things.
Well, I understand you're also presenting a case study to try to tease out the boundaries of it, right? So it is.
So but I am with you in spirit, and Jane Jacobs, and let's think about the sidewalks in the valley. It's that we want to create, supported where appropriate by technology, sometimes digital technology, rather than emphasis on technology.
And one of the things to make clear here, also to your point earlier, it's a cliche phrase internally at Sidewalk Labs that we're trying to bridge the urbanist technologist divide. But to a large extent, our product team is, in previous organizations, product and engineering that I've been in tend to be the gold standard. That is not necessarily the case at Sidewalk Labs, where our pillar teams or our urbanists or our subject matter experts in this case are really leading in terms of what that initial pain point, the vision is there. And then we're sort of coming in to help figure out how to execute against that, right? And how to get products built around that potentially. And so I think that ordering and that organizational setup are also kind of important to mention here.
Okay, time is racing. So why don't we continue on so that you get that in, and hopefully a few minutes for open data.
Do you want to skip to open data actually, and we'll come back here if we have time, because I want to make sure you get to open data, which I think is important.
Although I remember Mark specifically asked about mixed use. So
Mark, are you cool if we skip to open data and come back to this if we have time at the end? Because I want to make sure Craig has.
Yeah, no, I'm quite cool.
I agree.
Hey man, I'm so cool. Yeah. The one comment I had in looking at the material, because it's still pretty high level, and I get it, is you're really creating a new form of zoning,
Correct.
and the city has a regulation and enforcement aspect in that.
Correct.
And I don't think that's properly represented here in terms of, the city gets sort of some kind of periodic summary, de-identified, whatever. I mean, they will want and should have a lot more in-depth understanding of what's happening given their regulatory and enforcement role in this. So that would be my one comment on that. And other than that, I'm happy to skip it.
Yeah, and this again is presented not only in isolation from a deeper, sort of more sophisticated discussion of zoning, but also from any discussion of that regulatory framework. And there's a whole parallel set of issues that are raised by this on the regulatory policy side, which
there are, and there, I guess I'd charitably say they're sort of naively represented in here. So, so whenever you present it again,
right,
I think you just need to acknowledge that in some way.
Yeah.
This is another example of there's a lot more detail on the regulatory and policy side in what we're writing up for the minute, but for the sake of the DSAP, we were trying to focus on.
But I think, there's a common theme here, which is that we should, in future, we should have more content on the framing of the problem.
Actually, I'm going to go ahead and say this is probably a sign of success that we're getting to this point where we're bringing those different pieces together.
All right. Well, in that case, just in the interest of time, okay, if we could if we have time
we
to
can
come
come
back to this,
absolutely.
great. But
Yeah.
go ahead with the open data. Andrew, you'll be first up next.
So we've we've talked. We've sort of talked glancingly in the past about open standards. The idea, as Prem sort of mentioned, that this could be a place that's more like the web, where because there are a set of well-established standards, each of the components of the system can be swapped out without destroying the system. That is, it's not a proprietary stack. And this touches on the idea of open data, and I'm sure many of you, if not all, will be familiar with what's been happening on open data over the past, say, 15 years, where for example, one of the very early data sets was the Tiger data sets, which was a US federal data set about roads. That got used because that got released publicly. It was created by the Census Bureau. It then got used by a whole bunch of different companies that built geographical products on top of that, including a lot of the online mapping systems now. That was kind of an unexpected side effect. That happened a couple more times, and at some point, a bunch of people said, we should think about the value that data collected particularly by governments at each level, the value that it has intrinsically if it was, for example, sold to offset the cost of gathering it, versus making it open and allowing people to experiment with it and come up with applications for it that weren't foreseen at the time that the data was gathered. So over time there was more data made available. There were also regulations introduced in cities and in governments to say if data is collected and if it doesn't have privacy implications, it should, again, by default be made open. The same kind of argument that we're making for Quayside. Once all that data got made available, the expectation was that people would do interesting stuff with it. And that sometimes happened, but a lot of the time the data that was made available was chosen based on its easy availability and the ease of making it public, not really thinking about any particular use case. And so we're starting to see government organizations responsible for making data available focus more on use cases and then working back to, okay, what data might be useful to be collected. But that's very, very, very early, and it is generally a tiny fraction of the data that's made open. So we're kind of, partway along this arrow, and I'd argue that one arrow potentially is between where open data started off and what software developers and hardware developers and in general digital technology developers expect. So if I want to build an app on a phone that has a map, I go to maybe Apple's documentation for maps or Google's documentation for maps, Android, and so on. It's really well documented. You can copy and paste some code, get something up running very quickly. The data's standardized for every part of the world, so it doesn't matter whether the user zooms in Europe or in Africa or in Asia and in North America. The software system works exactly the same because all of the data about roads, about features, and so on have all been normalized to use the same format. And that's essentially what app developers are looking for, or hardware developers. We're not there yet in terms of the vast majority of open data. There might be, a particular city might collect data in a certain format, another city might choose a different format. There's no particular rhyme or reason, there's no common schema between them. And so if I'm a developer from a technology point of view, and I'm not talking necessarily about Sidewalk Labs here, I'm talking about the vast sets of entrepreneurs and students and innovators out there, they would need to first figure out the format of each city and then transform that to some common schema, and then maybe they could get to work actually building something that was broadly applicable. Because that's not the case, that kind of stands in the way of a lot of innovation. So I think one way that we can unlock urban innovation, especially in terms of these third parties, is to create a set of standards and start publishing data in those standards and try and figure out across multiple places around the world what those standards should be that would capture the same kinds of ideas in different places. And so I sort of mentioned the first thing here, allowing for faster innovation. I sort of mentioned in passing this idea of vendor lock-in, that is, if a city buys a system that's sort of vertically integrated and proprietary, where the data formats aren't well known, where there aren't interfaces to get data in and out, it might be that that city is forced to use that whole system and not be able to replace any pieces of it or iterate. They have to sort of take the lot, or they have to throw the lot away and buy a product from somebody different. If we can move towards something that's more like the web, it should be possible to interchange parts of the system from different vendors and have them work together in predictable ways. And then that creates, hopefully, an ecosystem of developers who are creating apps. And so now each of those developers might not be making enormous one-time sales to cities, so that the dollar amounts of each sale might go down, but now they can sell to thousands or tens of thousands of cities worldwide. This is, again, in this nirvana I'm imagining, when we all start to agree on a set of data formats. But they can sell those products very widely because everybody's essentially using the same ways of communicating. So I think I've covered most of these ideas. The how is still, I think, a work in progress and something that we'll have to figure out over time. There are some existing standards, and so I think a role that Sidewalk Labs can play is to start using those standards as much as possible and promulgate them, essentially. Provide, essentially, a critical mass of data in that format, for example, in Quayside. It might be that there are some standards that are in the right direction, but don't quite fit some of the challenges that we're trying to address. And so it might be that we'd work with the folks who develop those standards, who are using those standards to evolve them. And then there might be places where nothing exists, where we, along with partners, including cities, especially the city of Toronto, and hardware developers, software developers, to build those standards and get them, again, hopefully approved over time by international standards bodies. That's not particularly easy to get that final ratification, but we think it's an important area to drive towards. Let's skip one. So just to make this slightly more concrete, some of the standards that that are currently in use to some extent in cities. GeoJSON is very, very general. So this is essentially a JavaScript object notation with specific fields for latitude and longitude and allowing you to draw out polygons and so on. So it's a fairly high-level standard that just deals with geography. CityGML is, I think it comes from the Open Geospatial Consortium. This is a much more city-specific format for describing where streets are, where buildings are, and so on in great detail. And then OpenStreetMap is essentially a wiki-style approach to mapping, which now has mapped a vast amount of the world, basically through volunteers. They started, I think, with GPS traces, sort of driving around and biking around and contributing to this in an open way. But OpenStreetMap has an enormous amount of data. And they have a schema that's actually kind of loose, but is very adaptable to new ideas. But for example, one of the things it doesn't capture is very well is height. So if you try to represent, for example, where the Gardiner runs through Toronto, it essentially has the idea of kind of ground level and another level higher. rather than exactly how high is the garden at this point, how wide is it, where are the curbs, et cetera, et cetera. So that's an area where we suspect we need to go in and actually make some of the data more precise and actually work on the schema to be able to represent the kinds of things that will need to be represented in Quayside. In buildings, there's something called, some of you may have come across, called BIM, the Building Information Modeling format, which there's a closed version of this format. It's used by a program called Revit. But then there are there's an open format called the Industry Foundation classes, which are able to describe, the exterior of this building, where each floor is, where each room is, where each light is, what fixture we're using in that light, and so on. It's actually the way that engineers and architects and tradespeople communicate now exactly what they're building. Weirdly enough, it tends to get thrown away at the end of construction. We're suggesting that it should live on in an open format beyond construction, so that when somebody's operating this building, they understand where all the vents are and so on. And as long as the access is properly controlled to, for example, building management, making that data available to, for example, the people providing and operating the HVAC, the lighting, and so on. City GML and City JSON, I think I've got that twice, I guess, but again, representing city layouts. Shared Streets is a nonprofit that's developing a number of formats for describing the layouts of streets, and, for example, how you would describe where which part of the curb was not available for stopping, or was a taxi pickup drop-off zone, and so on, which turns out to be a trickier proposition than you might imagine. The generalized traffic feed specification describes transit schedules. So where are the lines, throughout Toronto for buses and streetcars? Where are the stops? What's the schedule for those stops, and so on? And that's the basis on which Google Maps, for example, does the routing. If you say, I want to get from here to here using public transportation, it uses GTFS. And likewise, all the other mapping programs like Transit, the Transit app, use the same data and the same format to provide their routing. Real-time bike share availability. So there's a standard for describing, there's a bike share rack just down here at Bay and Queens Quay. How many bikes are currently available? How many racks are currently available? Is transmitted in the bike share availability GBFS. Brick is to describe all of the heating and cooling elements and where the thermostats are and which thermostats connected to which heating and cooling and so on. So that's that system of a building. It's a standard that's not widely adopted, but is growing, and has just been blessed by ASHRAE, one of the industry organizations. And then we mentioned the Public Live Data Protocol 1 or 2 meetings ago, essentially, how you would represent data about if you're counting the kinds of activities that occur, in a park space and so on. So there are a number of standard data formats that already exist. There are many more, we think, that where there needs to be a standard. For example, we've been talking about flows of pedestrians and traffic and so on streets. There's no standard way of representing that and exchanging that between different systems easily and different cities and so on. And there's a bunch of questions and issues around cost, governance, and access. And so, again, I think these are more aspirational because, as I'll describe in a minute, I don't think we should be necessarily responsible for providing access to all of this data. But ideally, you would have all this data provided at free for research purposes and development purposes and so on, as this data is currently in a lot of the open data platforms for cities and countries and so on. But if we're talking about data that's going to get used a lot, maybe if it's used at very high frequency, or there's a massive amount of data which gets really expensive to host and to serve, there should probably be a way to charge the consumer of that data so you can actually recoup the cost to make this whole principle and process sustainable. Ideally, if there are multiple providers of the data, then there's a certain amount of competition which should drive the prices down for actually providing this. Governance, I think this hinges on something like a civic data trust. There should be a way for the civic data trust to say, if you're providing open data about this kind of thing, it should be in this format. That shouldn't be too onerous, but just that check, I think, will help in suggesting to data providers that they should pay attention to standards where they exist. And then potential industry consortia. So the Open Cities Network is something founded by Curtis and my vision and colleagues that's thinking hard about how this might work in a decentralized scheme to provide a lot of data. So there might be sort of private industry aspects of this. And then access. Again, we suggested publicly accessible by default, but with an option for restricted access. So for example, if there's private data involved, obviously, it should be restricted access. Or maybe if there's proprietary data where the data trust wants to allow the collector to be able to retain some of the data rights in order to sell the data, in order to defray the cost of the sensors and the deployment. And then there are models like Estonia's X-Road, I think we've referenced before, but essentially having a central technical authority that essentially receives requests to access certain data. If that's approved, hands out tokens to prove that permission, and then that token is used to actually get the data from a third party. In this case, this is Estonia's approach to allowing each government department to host the data, but have a centralized authority that governs who actually gets to access data from each of those, which we think is a really interesting model. Partly because it spreads out the technical lift of actually providing and hosting all the data, but actually also because it provides for a more robust system. If one agency is compromised, it doesn't mean that data from all agencies is compromised. So that's a very quick run through. I think I'll talk about this slide as well because it's kind of related.
Okay, you know what? Rather than doing that,
yeah,
because we're already at time, and
okay,
I've got a bunch of people who have raised questions. So why don't we
perfect.
Park that and just we'll eat into the break and make up some time. I hope so. About 15 minutes or so, and I've got Mark, Kevin, Andrew, and Charles, all with comments that have generated real interest. So,
my question actually wasn't about open data; it was about open architecture. I was hoping we would hear today a little bit more about open architecture in addition to open data. So can you elaborate what your thoughts might be in that area? Because services being able to access the sensors and whatever the systems is also a pretty important part of this.
Absolutely. And in
Not
fact,
just
I
the
guess
data,
this got
but
sort of compressed in the slide back here, where I mentioned some existing
protocols.
Systems and companies here. So there is already an architecture around open data. CCAN, for example, is an open source system that the City of Toronto uses. But again, it's kind of slightly in this older world of a lack of standardization of formats, and it doesn't necessarily focus so much on real-time data. We've had a couple of brief discussions with a local company here in Toronto, Think Data Works, which I think initially Christina pointed us towards. They've got a platform, Numina, where they're actually taking on a lot of the task of normalizing the data. So taking in open data and actually coming up with a schema themselves, essentially a data format, and mapping the various data sources to that standard so that their customers can then access via their APIs, essentially the data in a consistent format that's well documented by them. And that we feel is a pretty good model. I suggested to Christina that maybe the members of the committee at some point might be interested in talking to Numina sort of independently of this, because they're interested in thinking about what would it take to take their platform and actually make it into something that could provide the kind of functionality I'm suggesting. And in terms of data architecture, maybe I'm oversimplifying, and maybe we'll realize it's more complicated, but I think if there are a number of providers who are providing APIs which involve not just a standard formats, but also standard places to go to get data of this kind. So in the same way that I can go to Mapbox, which is a mapping company, and say, give me a map of London, there's a standard way of doing that. There's no different from the way I would ask for data from Moscow. I just give it a different set of coordinates. But there's a single place that I would go to get that data. So those two things, and then in a case-by-case basis, for example, if it's mobility, for example, if it's the sustainability and so on, having the data get to the right place and be available in the right format, that in a nutshell is the architecture we're proposing. Now, of course, that's super high level and vague, but I'm not sure you can necessarily spec the whole thing out for every possible use case ahead of time, rather than instead we're essentially setting a set of principles that we think this system should aspire towards.
Okay. But Kevin, Kevin, Andrew, and then there's Lena's question. Oh, Curtis. Okay. All right.
So we're talking about Open Data Hub. We're talking about a Civic Data Trust. Is the Open Data Hub an element of the Civic Data Trust? Is it the Civic Data Trust, or are they two completely separate, different things?
I think that's an open question, but I do have an opinion, and I'm not sure we have consensus within Sidewalk Labs. My concern is a Civic Data Trust, if it's required to be the data repository and to serve up data at low latency and at high volume and so on, that might be a very, very, very heavy lift to have an organization that's both fantastic at policy and some of these decisions, and also has a really robust technical infrastructure. If you can have those two things be separate, I can imagine a Civic Data Trust having the smartest policy people there, and then have maybe several other entities. Maybe it's Numina, maybe it's the Open Cities Network, maybe it's just CCAN version 10 that actually are able to serve up the data. And if one of them can't serve it up quickly enough, or for a particular purpose, maybe there's another one, a competitive one that can. And so there's a sort of an ecosystem of providers that have maybe some financial motivation. So that I think probably there has to be some amount of of business element to this, but separate from the data trust. But then you might ask some of my colleagues, and they might give you a slightly different answer.
When they're under one governance model,
So that's
or could there be?
I think the governance needs to be. I think the Civic Data Trust needs to be able to guarantee that if they make a decision about how data should be provided and to whom, that is respected by whoever is actually providing the data. So that's something that, to some extent, this Estonia model provides. But I think there's probably a lot of details to be worked out there. But I think that principle, if it's technically possible, is probably close to the right one.
So one thing that may be helpful is we've put together some amount of materials that we've read about Estonia's expert model that may be valuable for us to share with the panel.
Right. Yeah.
This is not material we put together, but material we've read over the last few months about the model that we're kind of, we would suggest that we think is the right route to go.
Okay. And just one quick comment on the use of open data. By definition, open data is free. So when we come to talking about cost recovery with open data,
so I actually
you have to be careful with the term.
Yeah. So I actually I have a war on the term open, because if you actually Google the meaning of the word, it's basically whatever flavor people feel like it means is what it means. So we're very careful when we use the word open to actually specify what we mean by that, in terms of, do we mean that it's accessible, that it's a published standard?
Right. More to the point, it's not like we're defining open, but I think to your point, open data has a specific meaning. So we've actually tried in other materials.
You can't mess with that.
Right.
And it's
So in other materials,
data license. So.
we've tried. Right. We've tried to say things like publicly available or publicly accessible data,
Fair enough.
Versus,
which might still have a fee associated with it if you are using it in vast quantities.
Because if you go to the public with this, the purists are gonna.
Yes, that's okay. That's good.
That's
feedback.
that's good.
And I think we probably
I actually did a control F somewhere on open in the mid-ep and was no. So we should probably do the same on these slides.
Andrew?
Thank you. Difficult is for me personally to pass up on my opportunity to ask some really penetrating questions. I'll give up my turn with the assurance that, because there's a lot of other questions that we're not going to be able to get to that are on Slido and so on. So I just like an assurance that the questions that we can't get asked in this way, we can follow up through that are written and become public in a timely way. And I will pass. And I see Christina nodding, and what will be the plan for that?
So the intent is to take the questions that are still left as open from the last session and this session and send them to Sidewalk for a written response. So that way, since things were building from the last session to this session, the relationships have been connected, and if there's still items that weren't addressed from the last one, we'll carry those forward too.
Yeah, if that can be done quickly and we have a chance to consolidate a little bit and then pass it over, I think that's
Absolutely.
great. So I'll pass.
That sounds excellent. Curtis and then
I'm not known for not. So, but I think what I'm hearing is really exciting. I think what you're so I guess this is a question to confirm what I think I'm hearing. So, basically saying we need data standards, and while there's international bodies that ultimately set standards, Sidewalk's sort of saying we have some expertise in this. We're putting up our hand. We'll help to kind of drive towards some standards. So I think that's awesome. I think the other thing you're saying is there's been, and I don't know that you've ever come out and said this, but you've also never come out and said not this. Mm-hmm. This idea that there would one day be this sort of like monolithic API layer provided by Sidewalk, where sensors have to integrate on one side, and then and maybe there's a data trust in between, but there's a set of applications on the other side that sort of ingest through this monolithic API. And I think what I'm hearing you say is, assuming everyone uses standards, the APIs and the repositories can live in a multitude of places. Yeah. And that, so that's
as long as there's at least one place that's a predictable place you can get it. Maybe there are 15, but there should at least be one, so that as a developer I can write it into my code and I don't have to like hunt around for a different one every year.
And whether that's a directory, whether it's set up as a federated, there are different options here, but you will find that Craig and I generally do not like the term monolithic, single point of failure, all those issues that come with that.
But I think so that's good. And then the last thing I'm hearing is there likely needs to be some key-based system that can ensure compliance with whatever governing body applies to the data sets.
That's right.
And that piece, TBD on who provides the key, right? Who do you trust to provide the key?
And we've received the message loud and clear from this group that it's not our role to define how that works. At least the policy piece. So I think that's a discussion for broader, and it's happening at Mars and so on.
So I want to go on record then saying that I think if those three things are true, I think I applaud you guys for listening.
Great.
So, awesome.
Okay, I think we're going to drop the mic and leave.
Okay, we'll do one more question. I think we're going to have to wrap up.
Yep.
Okay.
My question is a combination question, but I'll try and simplify it. Data governance, I'm going to verbatim and then I'm going to just drop into it a little bit. Data governance vehicles. So we keep talking about the digital trust, and there's almost we're deferring to that as the penultimate vehicle. Yet I don't see a lot of the proposal of how we would stand that up, or how you're proposing that would stand up. So governance of data is actually quite a significant investment, and it requires a huge amount of effort to stand it up, decision authority, agreement proposals, and it requires a lot of technology to actually host the data and to ensure that you're continuing to manage and steward it appropriately. And I just don't, I'm wondering, is Sidewalk Labs actually proposing a significant investment into that, or other models that you actually see apart from the one that we just keep talking about and deferring to? Because it is actually just theory at this point, and in practice, if you look into organizations, this is a very large investment.
So I'm going to try to touch piece of this, and Elisa, feel free to jump in at any point if you'd like to.
Because Lisa's been doing a lot of thinking about exactly this problem. So with the proviso that we're making suggestions, but we don't have a role that can actually create this thing. So,
as an example,
just let me
in the
be
minute,
clear,
we hope...
There's a plan to technology. So there's a whole product life cycle. You need to develop it, and then that's going to create a huge amount of data, obviously, when it's in use. If you think about governance, it has to be in parallel to that plan, but it also has to be in its broadest thinking of all types of data that will be produced, because you're going to consume the data and we want to regulate it and manage it, but how we produce the data is equally as important as how we consume it.
And I think what you're saying is we've talked a lot about how we're producing it, and then there's this black box we talk about the Civic Data Trust doing that governance, regulatory, and access.
In the data lifecycle, I'm assuming production is the data management standards, ontology, taxonomy,
correct,
governance, decision authority, vehicles for safety and soundness, protection, defense, efficiency, and value. In the consumption, and now who gets to use it, who's entitled to use it, what does that mean, what's the value proposition, what's the models, what's the cost?
So short version answer is that as Craig has said numerous times, we've heard pretty clearly from this group that Waterfront Toronto and this DSAP wish to own the definition of what the Civic Data Trust is, how it functions, what the roles are. Now, that said, in the MIDIP, we will be providing a proposal that we think, that we started providing a few months ago, that we have also kind of revved and iterated on in a lot of these areas around things like how Sidewalk Labs will, for example, approach security and resiliency, how we will approach internal governance, the RDUA process that we walked you through in the specific fields that we go through in the sample RDUA we published, which is like the full kind of sausage making process of how we ensure privacy by design principles are being followed. We think these are the sorts of things, by the way, that we are proposing essentially in the MIDIP, that a civic data trust that has some sort of either contractual and or regulatory / enforcement capability is able to take on and move forward in a broader realm for all entities, not just Sidewalk Labs that wish to function in this space.
So as part of the proposal, you would be suggesting that Sidewalk Labs would be funding this, the construction of...
So are you asking who pays for it specifically?
Specifically.
So I think one of the things that we are proposing, just to be clear in this, for example, is, one of the reasons why we said cost recovery to some extent in the access of data is because we think this needs to somehow have a model behind it that funds its existence over time, right? So how that gets funded initially, we're still figuring out. That's part of a large body of work, which is a much bigger piece of the puzzle also that we need to figure out how to do funding on from infrastructure on. And so I think that's an open question.
Sidewalk Labs, or we being everybody?
So Sidewalk Labs is making some pieces of those proposals. We're working with Waterfront Toronto on other pieces of those proposals. So there's a large body of work going on there to understand the overall kind of funding of this project. But that said, in this space, at least in the steady state funding, the way I at least view it is that the reason we did not want this to be all free data for anyone to access at any time is because, as you know, there are fundamental fees behind functioning such a group like this, and there has to be some capability, some capacity for fee recovery, as well as some capacity building that occurs inside the Civic Data Trust for that. So that was why we wanted to make clear that there's some carve out for that to exist, which we think is very important.
Yeah, I just have to leap in with a comment, which I think if there's going to be a Quayside Civic Data Trust, the Quayside project has to pay for it. Now, the Quayside project includes a whole bunch of entities, one of which is Sidewalk Labs. But I can't imagine the City of Toronto writing a check, or maybe the federal government might, from an innovation standpoint to help set something up. There might be some government funding partners. But within the project, if the Civic Data Trust is integral, then the overall business plan for the entire project has to fund its setup. And lots of money flows inside that project.
Yeah, and as Prem said, we haven't focused on things like how the setup would be for this meeting, but we do have some initial thoughts, not too dissimilar from what Mark is talking about, as to how a civic data trust could be funded for this project.
But that's also, by the way, one of the reasons why when Craig was talking about separating the data storage, the physical data storage from the data access, because when you combine those together, the technical capabilities and the cost to maintain that technical capacity goes up pretty quickly. And I would argue may not be able to keep pace with kind of the movement in private enterprise, and therefore becomes less useful and people subvert it and so on and so forth.
And by the way, just to go briefly into a speculative mode, to Mark's point, this would be a data trust for Quayside, but it seems to me that a lot of the issues and principles are much broader than Quayside. There's certainly a lot of principles and issues are going to be things that in the future will concern Torontonians, will concern Canadians, will concern people globally. And in a way, ideally, you would have some organization that was sharing ideas and technology with Amsterdam, with Sydney, Australia, with other places around the world, so that each neighborhood, each city was not building everything from scratch, figuring this thing out from zero, and they would be able to share a lot of that work and hopefully a lot of the technology, which is, I think, an interesting opportunity if something like this starts in Quayside in Toronto for Torontonians to be leaders in this particular aspect. So that over time, I feel like in the asymptotic version, the cost for Quayside alone would go down, you'd hope, because actually it's leveraging the fact that it's the same problem is being solved in the same way across the world.
All right, well, that certainly opened up an important line of discussion that quite clearly is to be continued in terms of some of these issues. Given that we're already 20 minutes over, I think we'll stop there. And thank you for your time. There's obviously some stuff that we can pick up next time around. Why don't we break for let's take the same 10-minute break. We need a break. Just a notice to especially people in the room that we will be having a motion to go into a brief closed session, so you have a bit longer to go for coffee if you want, and we will go back into open session as quickly as we can and reopen the doors. Okay. Need a motion to go into closed session.
I'll move it.
Second from Charles. Okay, so we'll go into closed session. Just bought us a chunk of time. Sorry to go off the order of agenda. Let's do the minute review. We wanted to have at least some opportunity for discussion on two issues, both the methodology and the criteria. Note that the criteria is we in the last meeting established a working group around this, so it's really just to ensure that we have a working group that will begin that work on the criteria. But it's open to discussion on sort of the how on the methodology, as well as any comments you might have otherwise.
And there was the open question on a working group on architecture. Actually, given the depth of passion around that subject, that we actually do some work in that area. And my suggestion is we do that. We have a small working group. Christina, I mean, having given it some more thought, I think the government engagement is useful, but as a phase two, I mean, I think we need a smaller working group that, in fact, comes up with a set of ideas and principles that we can then test and engage a broader group, including the governments, on what those principles are. Does that make sense to you, Curtis?
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I mean,
smaller is better in the initial.
I guess my rule of thumb, we have like the one pizza rule. You can feed the group with one pizza. It's a good brainstorming size. It can be a big. It can be a big.
Party size. In my work, you'd have to get everyone who ate that pizza to sign a piece of paper saying they ate it. So. It's true.
One slice rule?
Yeah, or the 2 for 1 pizza.
Okay. Not to jump ahead in the agenda, but with your permission, one of the other issues that we do have in the agenda is working groups. And it does strike me that rather than trying to get all the various working groups that we've identified up and running, we now effectively have 3 that allow us to beta test how this will function. We've got the governance to deal with panel issues. We've got the group that was established to deal with criteria. And now we've got, we'll have one on architecture. Why don't we just say we're going to do it? We will see what works and whether the information flows and the like work effectively. And we can then use lessons learned from running on those 3 to then apply it to the other working groups.
Great.
I think what would be helpful is if we all use the tools that we have so there's visibility. So if other panelists had something they wanted to add or review or whatever, so that there's transparency in this group, since everybody may not have the same timing and flexibility, that will also help to accelerate the work that's underway and eliminate the amount of travel required.
Okay, where are we at with the concierge to assist with?
That's in closed session.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Sorry. But I can, since we're somewhat following this, but not following this, and then we'll reorganize it so it fit back in this. We have an offer out to one of the candidates. They were an extraordinarily strong candidate. They have a competing offer from another group that we are just waiting to hear which way they go. And today was supposed to be that. They just emailed me and said they need one more day, just working with their current employer on some issues as well. If this lands, it will actually be extraordinarily helpful for this group. I was thrilled with the candidate, so it was worth actually taking a couple of extra weeks, because if we get the right candidate, we're actually going to save about 3 or 4 months of onboarding. So this person has got visibility, familiar with the project, all that kind of good stuff. So please keep your fingers crossed for me.
I was really asking more because I think success of these working groups depends on having support.
I agree.
So it will be a challenge.
Good point. And where are the working groups listed again? They were
in the Google.
It's in the Google.
And I keep bringing them forward for each meeting as part of the meeting materials, just so they're front and center. So if you go into there, it should be in the February. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, we've ticked off then really another. Let's save 10 minutes at the end to go back into closed session to deal with confidentiality protocols, and that still leaves now a bit of time to discuss or for feedback or comments if there are on minute review issues. I'm not sure if we're a bit spent on that.
I think if I could just make an ask of the group, I thought that kind of worked very well last time. There's some things that I need. Now, Pamela's mentioned a couple of different frameworks and models around sort of getting some feedback, and I think having a discussion around how this group would feel comfortable in not so much receiving the information, because that will be fairly straightforward, but in terms of organizing yourselves to get your feedback collected and reach consensus and have some sort of protocols that you're comfortable with. We don't want to be too top down on that, because what's worked well in other panels that Waterfront Toronto has may not be the case here. And in fact, they discovered their own way back in their inception as well. So if there are some ideas about how you would have seen this work well in other groups that you've been involved with that are dealing with complex challenges like this, please bring those forward. We're open to those other ideas.
I was going to say I've been asking for this for a while, but not providing any ideas beyond Slack, and so I'll try to be more proactive, providing more of a solutions orientation, because that's the thing I've wondered about is how are we actually going to do this, other than Google putting stuff in a Google Doc, which may be the way to go. I don't know, but
the challenge with me is I might have to send audio files because I can't type. Like, there's so many emails you guys write I want to respond to, but I just can't type, and voice recognition is a frustrating temptation solution that never works.
Well, as we talked about, I'm happy to have, if there's something that you wanted to have done, then, he's left right now, but if you want to send him, sorry, we'll volunteer him
while he's not here.
It's a commitment from me to you, is that if you want to send your voice dictation over to us, we'll type it out and circulate it to the group on your behalf. And that way you can participate as readily as everyone else in this too.
Okay, because a lot of times I'm like, I got something, but by the time I type it, it's about 20 emails down and it's obsolete.
Yeah, no, so we'll make sure if you just send your voice recording, Greg, who's just come back in the room, we'll type that out as soon as he receives it and send it out to the group. So you'll be as near real time as we possibly can.
And send the audio file with it just to...
Dave really said this. So that's.
I just want to quick.
I feel like the room is exhausted.
So the review that we are going to do, I understand it's not grading or anything; it's just feedback. There's no tension for us to have consensus or to be unanimous in our thoughts about this. So we could have opposing positions on any one subject, and that would go forward.
Absolutely.
Okay, to you for consideration. Right.
Yep, absolutely.
That's the whole minority report idea. There could be multiples. If necessary. Hopefully not. But if necessary.
And with a project this complex, there might be instances where you even see that, something is suitable for use in, this type of a scenario, but completely inappropriate for something else that they've been thinking about, so that diversity may actually be in their use cases that they're providing as well. So I think a very robust commentary around that with as many perspectives as possible will only enrich our ability to actually be able to evaluate it. So I'm not expecting this group to have one view. I gave up that delusion a long time ago, don't worry.
I feel like pragmatically it'll be really easy to get everybody to comment, but I do hope there's a chance for us to look at the big pile of our stuff together, because I might think something in isolation, but then when I say it out loud, you might think it's stupid. And I might be like, oh yeah, it was dumb. I'm just picking, because often, no. But you're coming at things from a different perspective than I am. And my idea, it's good, but Charles might think it's dumb too, whatever. Dave might think, but I learn when I'm at the table. And so I think unitized, we all have different points of view, which are individually quite valuable, but the frustration that we have with having seeing pieces of the things doled out, like Koala and a piece of software. It's easy to comment on small things, but it's the sum of the things together that's really going to matter. So I hope that our process, there's the time and the resources, frankly, of Waterfront Toronto, but everyone else's time too, that we can actually work together for more than we're going to need some time together to figure out collectively what the big picture thing is. Because
feedback doesn't replace collaboration.
No, and it's a very valuable, like I always leave wiser than I came in, so I'm grateful for the chance to interact. But it'll also help us sift what's the really most important stuff, because there's going to be gazillions of things to say, but I think some sense of priority and hierarchy is really going to matter.
So I'm hearing that there's maybe a workshop, like a session where evaluation we're put together.
Yes.
After we've done.
But maybe it comes after everyone. I don't know. After everyone's had a chance to digest
After
and
we've done
and then we can.
Yeah, usually it's individual then group things, so that way everybody can have their own
I don't know if
individual
that
view.
works
And
for
then
everyone, but I would appreciate that. So.
And to that point, you'll see that, so Claudia had put some placeholders in the calendar for 2019 and 2020. Those actually weren't compared against anything that was actually like our other boards and committees and things like that. So we've gone back through, Charles, Michael, and I, and looked at the calendar, looked at sort of the perspective, mid-up actual delivery dates and things like that, so that the meetings can be meaningful. And some of them we're suggesting are actually longer to that point, where we can actually have more time to roll up our sleeves. Some of them will be, the April meeting, for instance, will likely be a closed session meeting because we'll actually be dealing with the chapter. So doing that confidential review and coming up with not a consensus piece, but understanding each other's perspectives. So there's more than just the words on the page. So we're trying to actually build that into the model of 2019, 2020. So it's not a bunch of meetings where they just come and do a bit of show and tell, and then there's nothing actionable out of that either. So just we wanted to lay some framework around that before I had Greg cancel all the meetings that were scheduled and reschedule them all, since I know that was a bit of a challenge last year. And we'll also just issue a memo with all the actual dates on them for you, but avoiding things like March breaks and holidays and stuff like that too.
Question on so once we're past it's sounding like we have more than one round review given the timeline. Other than the confidential round, it sounds like the other two, well, I guess I'm thinking about the publicness of our feedback. So where is the feedback public, and if so, how is it shared with the public, and in what format do we think is, and I don't know if you've thought about that.
So I think there's a couple of questions to that. There's also the deliberations part of it, the sort of messy work that needs to happen. How much of that happens in public session versus a closed session where you actually can debate with one another and have some candid conversations. I think the product that comes out of that, like, that's absolutely public, but that's part of the methodology sort of conversation that I was hoping to kind of have you guys engage with, is what methods do you actually want to use to have those conversations with one another? I personally know that I'm a lot more candid when it's not being recorded and it's not the media is not in the room, that kind of stuff. So it feels like there's got to be space for both to happen, but I'll defer to you guys on that. But the end product would be public, and then we should have our communications people maybe at the next session just kind of go through what the consultation pieces look like and the various outputs that they've been thinking through, because that's been moving a bit as well through the process of better understanding the timing and so on.
to maximize the effectiveness of these messy meetings, as you call it, it might be good to have a professional facilitator in to maximize using techniques to get all the information synthesized.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, given the legislation we operate under, I'm not sure how you'll pull that off.
A facilitator?
No, the messy meetings in private.
I'll have Ian do a full review on
'cause
that, but
Because everything of substance that we come up with obviously needs to go onto the public record.
Right, yeah.
So they'll be trying to manage that. I agree that there's a need for smaller working groups.
Yeah, but it also has to operate under the City of Toronto Act for meetings.
We'll make sure, we'll get a review.
So that's really what I was referencing, Chantel, not the working papers. You're absolutely right on the working paper point. But
Okay.
in terms of the meetings, it's really the City of Toronto Act.
But even legal constraints or requirements aside, I mean, at least my hope would be that the panel would be operating, continue to operate with the goal of being maximally public as much as possible. And I think that's been our sense from the very outset, recognizing that there is value at times in having discussions that are not public, that allow for a more robust public disclosure once those are.
And there could even be that there's a closed session, a lengthy closed session, and then there's an open session that follows where there's a report out from the committee in near real time of the things that were discussed and major kind of findings and things like that. What I will do is between now and, well, definitely before the next meeting, but even before then, is have our folks talk to our governance advisors about what mechanisms we have to make sure that we're not offside with our open meeting requirements and things like that too.
All right, back on track. Okay, well, I mean, I think we've got a better. This has been very helpful. I think there's been a lot of desire amongst panel members to get a better handle on what all this was going to look like, and I think today's help provide us with it.
Do we have some anticipated action around the ad hoc committee? I mean, is somebody going to lead that and convene that?
Yeah, so now out of this meeting, Greg will be scheduling the follow-up meetings for each of the working groups as well as setting out the new dates. So he will do some doodle polls on those ad hoc groups because we also need to loop in our KPMG teams and so on to make sure that they're available for those dates because they'll actually be working sessions for that as well.
And will those be all in-person sessions?
Virtual, likely virtual, just to save on travel. And that's not the money savings on travel, it's the time savings for you folks, especially since it's winter still.
Just on behalf of the governance group, I think our discussion, and we were in closed session, the things that we focused on really suggest that there's expertise that really matters around the table, and we've got a series of people who've applied. So I don't want to add extra work to you, but if you can buzz through the people that we have to work with, if you think there are particular people with particular skills that would hone what we need to do, your wisdom would be really appreciated. So yeah, it'd be really great.
And I just wanted to note, I was looking for a change because it looked like the same committee structure as last time. At the end of the last meeting, I said I was notably absent from,
right,
and I said that I was very comfortable with being put where there was a place of most need.
Okay.
So I'm not self-selecting anything, but feel free to put me into one of those because I didn't necessarily want to be absent.
Okay, great. And
Game is what I'm saying.
And Curtis, I was going to ask you about the criteria committee. You weren't here when we were taking volunteers for that, so I was wondering if you might be interested to be a part of that group as well, just in terms of the business model.
Sure. I mean, for me, the architecture and business model have always been the same thing in my mind. But if it makes sense to have a voice in both of those,
the consistency too, or alignment, it makes sense to have you on both, and you can see how the two align.
Yeah. So yeah, sure.
All right, well, in that case, we have one more issue to deal with in closed session, so I need another motion to go back into closed session. Sorry.
They're
all here.
They're allowed to stay.
Okay, that's it. All right. We're losing people. Good. Okay, so you want to walk us through the confidentiality issue?
Okay, so as you know, we have these confidentiality agreements. Some of you have signed the sort of standing confidentiality agreement, and that's fantastic. Others of you have signed one-time confidentiality agreements around the PDA review, which worked well. So for this chapter sort of briefing and review and access to materials, there's two pieces of that will essentially be offered. One is briefing with Sidewalk Labs. They've done this for our executive team for the chapters as well, where they will walk through the major things that are in the chapter so that you have the appropriate context and things like that. And then actually getting access to the chapters themselves. both of those, because of where we're at in the process and the fact that you're getting sort of the messy work in progress piece, would be under the confidentiality agreement. So we would need to do a confidentiality agreement similar to what we did for the PDA, just to guide through this process. Keeping in mind that this chapter may look nothing like it by the time it actually hits the public, based on everything that we have been feeding back, and then hopefully you'll feedback as well to them. So I just wanted to make sure that those of you who had not signed the confidentiality agreement, that's a standing one, I'll be getting you looped in with Samir just to work through the mechanics on that, and any customizations that you need for that make it comfortable for you is fine. And if you're not comfortable going through that process, you know, it would be a shame not to have all the voices around the table for that, but there is an opportunity then, if you're not comfortable with the confidentiality agreement as is, to sort of just wait until the next stage, and you'll still have an opportunity for your voice to be heard. So we're trying to be as flexible with options, but I'm hoping the custom sort of confidentiality agreement will work in this case as well.
I didn't sign the blanket one, but signed sort of the custom one for the time, and if that can be updated to just reflect the particular documents,
The scope, yep.
The scope and the time period, that I'd be fine with that.
So we'll use your precedent ones from the past, and then if you just take a quick peek at it and make sure that there's nothing else that's changed, we'll just work on those. So Sidewalk has actually provided me with 6 or 7 dates for potential briefing sessions in March. They'll be virtual. You don't have to travel for those either. I'll circulate those as a doodle poll through Greg, and the top 1 or 2, depending on where we land. That way we can do drop-in sessions, and they're not formal and structured and things like that. But it's just a chance for them to tell their story, explain where they're at with it, things that are still open-ended, because there's going to be things, you'll see a lot of what they have TKs everywhere in their editorial text of things that are still pending, and that way they can give some sort of trajectory on it. I'll also take the opportunity to give you an overview of things that we flagged at that point in time with the latest version of the chapter, so you know where Waterfront Toronto stands with the content on that chapter as well.
That work for everyone?
There's also one other piece that I was reminded of when Eric was up there, and that is we're going to start to receive elements of the business model that we've not seen before in terms of the IP and digital elements and the purposeful solutions. And there's going to be elements around procurement, and then sort of validating some of the pieces around what's actually a purposeful solution versus not, and things like that. So I'd like to also, as that comes in, just be able to share that with those in this group that are interested in that piece. Wouldn't necessarily have to be the whole group, but maybe the business model and architecture folks may want to take a peek at that. But making sure that the specific confidentiality agreements will deal with that as well. So we don't have to do multiple different confidentiality agreements. So basically it's just like draft mid-up considerations kind of deal, if we're comfortable with that.
Okay, that's good. I think it'll provide the panel with a chance to engage with the meat a bit in terms of what's going on without having to wait, which is valuable. And Sidewalk actually came up to me during the break saying that there were a couple even questions that we had during our open session with them earlier that had that discussion happened as part of the session that they're planning to do next month, they would have been able to engage in a bit more fulsome discussion, but feel constrained to do so at the moment in public. So the point was made, they're anxious to be able to move to that next stage to have those kinds of conversations.
I'd be really happy on the IP and business considerations. You could add me to that.
Okay, well, if that's that, then we can finish early. That's crazy. We need a motion to go back into open session. And David?
That's something to adjourn.
And a motion to adjourn. Wow, that was such enthusiasm.
Yeah.